And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Great today to have Trevin Wax on the podcast. Trevin, how are you this morning?
Doing great, Josh. How are you?
Yeah, so Trevin, doing well. Looking forward to this conversation. In fact, I've been looking forward to it for a while. I've really just been blessed by your writings, kind of your insight on the intersection of faith and public life and culture. And so looking forward to this conversation. Listeners would be aware that recently we had a conversation with Brett McCracken, and mentioned in that episode a breakout session at the Gospel Coalition Conference with Brett, Trevin, and also Sam Alberry on how to navigate this moment, especially the sexual revolution and everything that's going on. I found that extremely helpful. And so I wanted to kind of reproduce that conversation a bit here today for the listeners. So as we get started, perhaps if you're unfamiliar with Trevin is a Senior Vice President for Theology and Communication at LifeWay Christian Resources. He's a former missionary to Romania, which I think gives him some really interesting insights. He's also a regular columnist at the Gospel Coalition, has contributed to the Washington Post, Religious News Services, World, and Christianity Today. Author of a number of books. We're going to talk about a couple today, Rethink Yourself primarily, but he also has some other great works out there. So Trevin, it sounds like you don't have much going on at all. So would you briefly just explain kind of your background and what your current position is?
Yeah, so I grew up in Middle Tennessee and was born and into a Christian home. Came to know the Lord at a young age. Lord really gave me a passion for mission work later on in my teenage years. And that was really sort of an awakening for me. That's what led to mission trips to Romania, and also to me sensing the Lord calling me to go there for college and to do ministry while in college there. So I got full-blown immersion into the culture there. I met my wife there, had our first son during a 5-year period in which I was pretty much based in Romania. Came back to the States, did master's work, I've served in various churches as associate pastor, teaching pastor. I've been at LifeWay for around 10 years. And am in a period of transition to a new place of service here soon, but have thoroughly enjoyed these years at LifeWay. I got to help start the Gospel Project curriculum that's used by small groups across the country. Have been involved with the launch of the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible translation that came out a few years ago. So the Lord has also blessed us with 2 more kids. So we've got 3 kids total. So it's just, the Lord has blessed ministry in many ways for us. And it's just been a privilege to be part of his, to be in service to him.
And are you teaching some at Wheaton College as well, or did I get that confused with someone else?
That's right. So I'm a visiting professor at Wheaton. So, I'm teaching twice there this year, different modular format, but love being able to interact with students from across the country, also around the world. The kinds of people that come to Wheaton are just top notch and amazing. I learn from students as well, as hopefully they're learning something from me.
Well, and what you mentioned there is exactly why I hope to have you on the podcast, and that is in our quickly changing culture. I sometimes talk about the kind of the velocity and the ferocity of cultural changes these days. It's important as Christians to think through Scripture and look at how to live that out in this cultural moment together in community. And certainly we have to live out our own callings, be fully persuaded in our own minds. But I find it extremely helpful to talk to others that are trying to do that same thing, live out the gospel in this moment. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on some of the things that are going on. Primarily, one of the things I believe is at the very root of the cultural change in our society, and that is what we want to call expressive individualism, personal autonomy, but this idea that, in a sense, we are our own God, we have to follow our heart, that sort of thing. And you recently wrote a very helpful book on that called Rethink Yourself. And so I wanted to jump into that first and then get down into some of these cultural issues as well. But concerning that book, Rethink Yourself, you talk about the phrases, be true to yourself and follow your heart, which are just par for the course. I mean, if you've watched a Disney video, like can all of the Disney princesses be wrong? Surely not. But how are those phrases problematic? And also be interested on how's our version of expressive individualism different than other cultures?
Yeah, so I wrote the book, as a way of unpacking what expressive individualism is without using those words
Yeah,
except in
sure.
endnotes, because I wanted people to understand the concept, even if they didn't get the academic term. But I think the expressive individualist idea that you look in to discover yourself, to define yourself, and then you look out to express yourself. That's a really good summary of how most people in Western societies, anyway, view the purpose of life. They may not articulate it that way. They may not even have given much thought to it, but I think that's a pretty good summary of what a lot of people just take for granted as common sense. So, of course, be true to yourself, follow your heart, chase your dream. All of those things are go part and parcel with expressive individualism. So, what I wanted to do in the book was I wanted to expose that, to show people, first of all, that they have probably downloaded this framework for thinking without even realizing it. And the way I do that is by, as you mentioned, comparing it to other cultures. At least at first, that's one of the things I wanted to do, was to show that, hey, the stuff that you think is common sense here in the West, it's not common sense in other parts of the world. In fact, we may look in first and then around to others, and then maybe up to God for some kind of inspiration or transcendent reference point or some kind of spiritual dimension to our life. But most people across the world and throughout history actually have looked around first to the community to define who they are and what their role is and who they're going to be. And then they look up to God or to some sacred order that's underpinning things. And then within that framework, they find some kind of room to look in within themselves. What I wanted to do in the book, though, is to show that, hey, this may be common sense over here, that we look in first, and it may be common sense in other parts of the world that you look around first. But the Bible actually conflicts with both of those ways and would have us look up first to God and his design, to what he has made us for, to our purpose being in relation to him, and then to around to the community of faith that he puts us in, and then in as we become the people that he has called us to be, and are providing unique gifts to the community of faith and to his glory. So the point of the book was to open people's eyes to see this, so that they would recognize it in, like you mentioned, movies, but also in songs and television shows and books and just about anywhere you can find the philosophy, slogans, all sorts of places, so that people would see it and then be able to interact with it and think through it more critically, rather than just sort of adopting it because that's what everyone does.
Do you think that this philosophy, and I'll use the expressive individualism just as a kind of a short term for it. I agree that most people are like, expressive individualism, and that's followed by an eye roll, like, what are you talking about? But just for our purposes here, that has even made its way into the Christian church and even to some of our sermons. And so church isn't a place where you come and find community identity in Christ, pick up your cross and follow Jesus. Church is more about it's more the place that helps you in your journey for self-fulfillment, and God is this supernatural deity that's supposed to just make you happy. Is a sense that I get sometimes in the church. But do you see the same thing?
Yeah, well, some of the surveys here are a little disappointing and depressing when you see how Americans in general answer questions related to the meaning and purpose of life, significance. And then when you see church-going Christians, how they answer the same questions. There is a little bit of a disparity, but it's not much. It's not enough that you would think, wow, Christians are really standing out here. So one of the challenges that we face, I think, is that a lot of people, like you said, they attend church, or they're religious or engage in some kind of religious practice because they think it helps them do what expressive individualism says, find themselves better, to express themselves better, to so that's the challenge, is that a lot of times people will, the idea that expressive individualism empties churches isn't quite true. What it actually does in many cases is it fills churches with people who believe that the church is going to help them be the better you, be the better, be truer to themselves, follow their dreams, chase whatever desires they have. And so that's one of the challenges that we face, I think, is that a lot of church-going Christians have unknowingly bought into this kind of framework for thinking and acting in the world without even being aware of it.
That's so true. And when I think of consumer Christianity, the term that gets thrown around a bit. But having been a pastor's kid, been in ministry for a time, this really just breaks my heart, because people are looking for a product from the church to just help them, find themselves, discover, express themselves. When that's not what Jesus is offering. And when you bring what Jesus actually has to offer, which is so much more rich and deep, that's not really what I want. And they'll just go find another church that will serve that need. So how can churches communicate this in a way where it helps people, kind of the light bulb comes on, oh, I see the difference, but also show the beauty of discipleship and what true Christianity is?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways that we have to think about this. And I generally am one to say that good preaching won't always take on expressive individualism head on. Good preaching is going to do something that and not only preaching, but also in discipleship materials and in conversations and people that are aware that this is a challenge. In these conversations, I think Christians that are aware of this will do a couple of things. I think first, they will recognize what is true about expressive individualism, the look-in approach, like why, not just what's true about it, but why does it have the appeal it has? And there is an appeal. I mean, there is an appeal to, pushing back against conformity with your community's expectations, or things like that. There's an appeal for, I'm going to chart my own way. There's an exhilaration that comes with that. So and God did make us unique. He did make us as individuals. He didn't make us to be, just to sort of morph into the community and not to have our individuality celebrated in some sense. So I think good conversation around this issue starts with, well, why does this appeal to people? There must be something true in it if people are attracted to it. But then you have to show, okay, but what's untrue about it? What are the lies in it? Because it's not, and I think the way you do that is that you actually begin to show the problems with it consistently. In the consistency of it is that it doesn't actually lead to all the things that it promises. So I think you have to move then into, okay, I see why you're attracted to this. Yes, you've got a right longing to sort of become a better person, or to be true to yourself and whatnot. Well, let me show you how this way of life that you've been thinking about is actually not leading you in that direction. Here are the problems with it. And there are all sorts of inconsistencies to point out. There are all sorts of areas, I call them areas of anxiety, that people in our culture and our society feel. And good conversation around expressive individualism among Christians should press into those areas of anxiety, to where people can recognize and be like, yeah, I get that. I get why that, I felt that before, or yeah, my desires are all kind of messed up and they go crossways and they're not all the same, or that, or I kind of have been exhausted. I've been on this exhilarating personal quest, but I'm also exhausted, or I'm not receiving the affirmation from people that it doesn't mean as much as I thought it would mean. And there's all sorts of ways that it breaks down. So I think showing that it doesn't work, showing the problems with it is the second step. And then the third and most important step is not simply to come at it from the biblical perspective saying, see, all that's wrong. Here's what the Bible says, and kind of hitting it head on. There may be times when that's an approach to get people's attention, but generally speaking, what you want to do is you want to show, hey, the gospel is better. The gospel is better. Jesus is better. Christianity is better than this. And the way that you do that is you show how Christianity, the light of the gospel, shines on those lies within expressive individualism, but answers the deeper longings that led people to fall for that philosophy of life in the first place. So that's the way that I think we've got to, and it's challenging and it's difficult, and it's going to look different from person to person based on the needs and the personalities of the people we're talking to. But I think that's really the urgent need of the day.
That's really helpful. And you pointed out something in the book that I had not thought about before, and that this would affect different people differently. So kind of the 20-something, the 30-something, someone 40 and beyond. How does this kind of reigning life philosophy in the United States affect different generations?
Yeah, I actually had a couple of different age people in mind when I was writing Rethink Yourself, because I knew there'd be people at different stages of life and wanted to speak to them all as much as possible. And the first one, I did think of the 20-something, person who's maybe almost about to be out of college or is out of college, I wanted them to see this first, and because at that age in life, you're about to be making a lot of big decisions, usually decisions about marriage, about career, about family. It would be good to rethink yourself and some of that common sense wisdom that you just take it for granted at the outset of your journey. So the 20-something there, I thought of, the 30-something who may be in church or discipleship or whatnot, who may be a Christian who has never really thought through these things and has actually adopted more of worldly philosophy than they realize, and that they're open to conversations about that. They're wanting to go deeper in their faith. But then I also thought of the 40-something or even beyond, who they've been around the block a few times. Life's hit them upside the head. They're looking back, and some of the things that they thought would bring satisfaction, fulfillment have not. I wanted the book to carry that as well, and to help that person get a second start, and to look back at and to kind of recognize, hey, this is why this didn't work. This is why these decisions I made, they didn't turn out the way that I thought they would, and be able to move on from there.
That's helpful, because there might be a tendency among older Christians to think, oh, this is not my thing. This is the 20s or 30s. But I do believe that it has so long been kind of the air that we breathe, that it has affected all of us, regardless of life stage. And we need to be aware of it. And the kind of 3 steps you mentioned are really helpful. So you're talking about how the gospel shines light on the problem, kind of answers that deep longing. I love how you kind of framed the gospel as the greatest adventure, or following Jesus as the greatest adventure. Page 192, your book, you said, remember the greater adventure, to be true to your future self, to know that you aren't enough, but Jesus is, to follow the heart of God, and to chase the dream he has for the world. And so why is that the answer, kind of the deeper answer for the longings that we have? How would you kind of answer that, or show somebody the beauty of the gospel?
Yeah. So, that's one of the reasons that expressive individualism has gotten the traction that it has in recent years is because many of the dramatic stories that we love to tell, narratives, fairy tales, all sorts of things, make it exciting to look inside and be true to yourself, and to cast off conformity with everything else. At the end of the day, though, that's a lonely and individualistic way of looking at life. It doesn't have the place for community, where there's actually going to be very rich bonds of obligation and of connection. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do, like as you mentioned, that last part of the book, is to show the gospel answers those deeper needs by drawing you into this bigger narrative, to this bigger story that actually far exceeds your own individual pursuit. You find your greatest fulfillment and satisfaction by becoming the person God has called you to be within this larger story. And so I think it's going to be important for us as believers in the 21st century, as good citizens of the US, and as people who want to see the gospel go forth. We're going to have to show people the narrative adventure of what the Bible is talking about. Why self-denial instead of self-expression, but self-denial in pursuit of a greater joy, of a greater self-fulfillment. Why that sort of countercultural way of looking at joy, at life, the whole idea of picking up your cross and denying yourself, and these things that Jesus calls us to, they're counterintuitive and they're countercultural, but they actually are leading us to a better to something that is even a greater adventure, that is actually going to lead to everlasting fulfillment. So I think capturing the narrative drama of the grand story of the Bible is super important here. And this is where I think as Christians, we have a lot of work to do. There's been a lot of good work done on this. But I think if we're going to compete with the master narratives of, Disney films and other things, we're going to have to get better at showing, not just saying, but showing why, stories of why this is, the best way to live, in the way that God calls us to live.
So I think it was Brett, and I was asking him, I couldn't remember if it was you that said it or he said it, making essentially self-denial cool again, or like self-discipline cool again. It's a bit of a hard sell, but there is a certain attraction to that. And what I love about the biblical narrative is that ennobles anything, and whether it's the mechanic or the single mom working to make ends meet. If you're a part of this kingdom and fulfilling God's call in your life, I mean, you're part of this kind of cosmic, narrative, this amazing story. And that picks us up off of, well, I had this dream, but it failed. And now it's crushed me. And now I got to go find another identity, which I think brings a lot of the anxiety. So that's really, really helpful. How can we do a better job? Now, you've mentioned there's been some good work done on this, but how do we practically make this happen? So how do we show the people in our communities, whether that's a more rural place in the United States, an urban location, whether we're in a profession or in a serving type of work, how can we show our fellow citizens this kind of better story?
Well, I think it starts with considering our whole life as witness, not just what we say as witness. So other people getting to know us and seeing our lives from the outside in. And actually, I mean, this is one of the areas where I'm seeing more and more done on this because I think it's important, is hospitality, the inviting of other people into your home, into your life, in order to see what the Christian life looks like in fleshed, rather than just sort of in ideas or on social media or in the polarized debates that we have in our society. So I think there's something that can be really transformative about hospitality, about sharing meals together, about all where people are able to see that there's a different value system at work here. There's a different framework for thinking, for processing, for making decisions. There are different things at play rather than sort of the things that you just expect. Though, a lot of people in the world just expect if this pays better, I go this way. If this is a job decision or this, where you're sort of climbing the ladder, chasing the American dream, that kind of thing. And unless we have people who are going to do things that turn heads, make decisions at times that don't make as much sense, but people recognize that there's still a joy and a fulfillment there that goes beyond temporal circumstances, it'll be hard for us to really have the platform upon which to share the good news, because otherwise we run the risk of us just looking like everyone else, not really talking about the hope that is within us, because people don't recognize any different hope that is within us, and so I think that's important for us to live in that way that would make people take a second look at what it is that's driving us.
And that may be a little easier as culture secularizes. Right now there's still a good bit, at least in places around the United States, of kind of Christian subculture that's wired into communities. But as that changes, and it's changing quickly, the idea of a kind of rooted Christian family that ministers to all of their neighbors, that prioritizes a church over even career advancement, I think those things will turn some heads. So perhaps culture may assist a bit in showing the distinction between those two approaches.
Yeah, so, and it's harder and harder, as the culture shifts take place. I think it gets harder and harder for us to do this, but also more meaningful when we do. So, everything's pulling against the idea of, let's really get to know our neighbors. Let's really we're locking ourselves into tribes. And I'm speaking of this from experience. The pandemic in particular has been a rough year for many people, I think, evangelistically, just because you've basically not come into contact as much with people who don't share your faith that you would want to speak to. So even as the culture shifts and things get harder, I think though that the intentional effort is going to stand out even more, and that's an opportunity.
That's good. So I wanted to turn now and kind of apply these principles to the LGBTQ issue. And perhaps this is the most pronounced, or maybe the most obvious place in our culture where this kind of expressive individualism is playing out, not just in individuals' lives, but also in public opinion and even in court cases. Again, kind of becoming this reigning life philosophy. And so, again, I found that conversation among you and Brett and Sam very, very helpful. So would you share a little bit about how, given what we talked about thus far, how should we engage our LGBTQ neighbor and think about cultural changes on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to recognize that as people, because we live in a society that is dominated by this look-in approach to life, and this, this approach to life that is expressive individualist. When you overlay that onto sexuality, and then you mix it with as well identity politics, which is also, where basically we are receiving or creating our identities, and our identity is such that, one of the things that I like to say, if you live in a culture where the first and greatest commandment is to be true to yourself, and the second commandment is like it, to affirm the self your neighbor decides to be true to.
Oh, wow.
Then the greatest sin you could commit would be either to fail to be true to yourself, or to fail to affirm the self that your neighbor says they're going to be true to. And so it's this weird paradox in which Christians may view, traditional Christians may view their LGBTQ neighbor, for whatever, as they're living in sin, or they're, and not just LGBTQ, but I mean, Christians tend to generally think in terms of all sorts of behaviors that are outside the bounds of marriage between a man and a woman, right? So, fornication or sex before marriage, adultery, all sorts of things, we would look at that and say that's sin. Whereas because the LGBTQ overlay of identity on top of the expressive individualism underpinning or framework has taken place, most neighbors are going to see us as the sinner rather than see themselves as the sinner. They will see those who challenge their identity, because they do mesh it together as their identity. They're claiming an identity based in sexual attraction and behavior. They would say that because we're failing to affirm that identity, we are actually attacking them personally. You're not questioning behavior, you're not challenging. And I do wonder how this is going to play out as we move into this era where there's all sorts of other behaviors taking place. So polyamory, for one, I'm seeing that more and more, people claiming to be polyamorous rather than monogamous, but that's not really an identity, at least not yet. It's sort of, this is a camp I'm going to be part of, but I wonder if that will eventually become an identity. It's just the days ahead are going to be really interesting as we look to this. And I don't see any easy way for us to overcome some of those obstacles, aside from our perspective anyway, the willingness to seek to be a friend, like a friend who, not necessarily because you're in agreement or not with other people, but to look for ways to show God's grace and love to other people that overcomes certain disagreements and debates. There will be cases where that won't be received, that won't be accepted. But I have to think that one of the ways forward is for us to pursue those kinds of friendships, even with the difference in ideology, because what other platform do we really have to be able to share the gospel in a way that is embodied, where the grace and fragrance and love of Christ is actually seen in our hands and feet witness.
It's really helpful. And from a legal perspective, I certainly stand by, Christian institutions must have the right to proclaim, live out the faith within their organization. But then when we kind of step into culture, and how are we going to engage now? If it's just, that's all we ever say, religious liberty, then it just sounds like we want to protect our own interest. And I don't think you're ever going to change anything or transform anything if you're not stepping out to also say, we may not disagree, or we may not agree on everything. In fact, we may strenuously disagree on this particular issue, but I want you to know that I want to get to know you, that you're a fellow image bearer, and want to build a relationship with you. And I don't think there's any other motivation in culture, other than just seeking power, that would motivate that type of conversation. And hopefully those that would oppose the Christian view on this would at least be able to see through to our heart if we take the time to have those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a troubling time where I think it is hard for people to see through to other people's hearts. And I mean, I see this happening on the other side as well. I think a lot of people answer the question you asked about, you're getting to know or loving someone who says they're part of the LGBTQ community or something, and tend to see everybody as an activist, sort of an ideological opponent. And certainly there's a place where activists are going to clash, activists for religious liberty, activists for, what they perceive to be against slights on the dignity of other people and whatnot. And so this, I think it's important though for us to step back and to recognize that to put everyone in the same box of activism actually will flatten our interactions with real life people who are coming at this issue with different experiences, different backgrounds, and who are raising different kinds of questions. So I think to bring scripture to bear on this subject in the context of relationship is vitally important, but that context of relationship, as much as it depends on us, Paul says, to live at peace with everyone. So that's got to be the posture in those interpersonal relationships for sure.
And to your point, I've even found that those in the public square, so even elected officials from the LGBTQ community, define themselves that way, that even sometimes if they're promoting policies that would make them appear to be someone that would never have a conversation with a Christian, I've actually found that there are opportunities, that they're still willing to have that conversation and entertain some dialogue about it, where there will be some that just absolutely cut you off if that's what you believe no more. But there's, I think, greater opportunity than perhaps I even realize and many Christians realize right now.
Yeah, well, that's encouraging.
So that brings us kind of a recent article that you wrote, one that I was fascinated by, because certainly, many Christians live in a bit of a social media echo chamber, or I sometimes call it the Christian bubble, right? So, if you're part of a church, Christian school, you have certain friends on social media, you don't get a different perspective. But I thought your article was helpful on, if you just say, okay, get out of your bubble and go talk to other people, then that'll solve all the problems. And the solution for the increasing polarization, division in our society is just if people will talk to each other. But you said that doesn't necessarily work either, and had some suggestions for actually dealing with the echo chamber. Would you dive into that article a bit?
Yeah, well, I think that article wasn't so much about breaking out of the echo chamber in order to talk with other people. It was research done on those who sought to break out of the echo chamber of the news intake from the angle they were always getting. So they were diversifying their news intake. So they did some research on this because that's one of the challenges we have right now, is a lot of people are basically only gravitating toward news services who are going to provide the news from the slant they already agree with, which is a reinforcement mechanism rather than an actual coming into contact with what other people are actually saying. And as news and commentary are more and more combined in recent years, it's just difficult to even understand, like, what's the difference between an actual what should be trying to be objective news report versus something with a ton of spin. And then there's all sorts of questions then about media bias and whatnot. So one of the things though that I was pointing to was a research study that showed that people that escaped their echo chamber, that they spent a month, looking at tweets from people on the other side, or getting into social media from the other side, were actually more likely to be reinforced in their belief than they were to actually be challenged or to moderate at all or to understand where the other person was coming from. And the reason I think that's the case is because the people that you would immediately assume, I'm going to listen to people on the other side, tend to be the loudest and often most divisive voices. So I meant, like, you've got someone who watches Sean Hannity every night decides they're going to watch Rachel Maddow instead, or vice versa. Well, for a month, the level of sort of condescension toward the caricaturing of other views that you find in both those programs, honestly, is such that I could totally see why the liberal is going to be more liberal at the other end and think, man, those people are crazy, or the conservative is going to be like, they're going to destroy the country, kind of a thing. So, well, I think in order for us to actually escape the echo chamber in a way that leads to better conversations is for us to seek out a few suggestions there from a book called The Scout Mindset. To seek out reasonable voices on the other side, people that you find to be thoughtful, even if you disagree with them. They're not flamethrowers. They're not trying to just entertain you or to be part of the anger, outrage, media, entertainment complex and all of that. They're actually there to be reasonable. You could also look for people that you already share some kind of common ground with, but recognize that there may be differences. So, this would be Christians listening to other Christians who you have a unity around the essentials of the faith, but maybe you have a difference on particular political policies, and you're just wanting, like, why do they think that way? I mean, we read the same Bible. We believe the essentials of the faith. And other times, one other way to escape the echo chamber is to partner with people who have a similar goal, even if you have different worldviews. So, I think of like, Feminists for Life, or they're secular people that are pro-life versus, what does it mean for someone who doesn't even believe in God to partner with a Christian organization on pro-life policy? Well, you can have interesting conversations when you share a common mission or a common goal, even when there's different ideology underlying that. So those conversations can be ways of just stretching your mind a bit, getting out of the echo chamber to where you're only hearing things that you would typically agree with. So those are some suggestions for effective ways of breaking out of the echo chamber so that you can actually think rather than just be fed what other people think you should think.
Yeah, I was chuckling earlier about, people are trying to, okay, I'm supposed to go listen to the other side. And then it's just like, well, it's exactly what I thought it was. And so I'm going to go back. Yeah, it doesn't solve it. So I thought it was really helpful. I've certainly experienced that sort of thing in public life. That's the only way I've been able to kind of expand alliances on religious liberty, that sort of thing. We won't agree perhaps on 100%, but like you said, finding somebody that's reasonable on the other side. So I'd encourage listeners, before you switch over, maybe if you're on CNN to Fox News or Fox News to CNN, to go seek out individuals like that in your community. It's really helpful. So kind of last question before I wanted to ask you kind of what's going on in your ministry, and also kind of a billboard question. Saw your tweet this morning about how Christians can gravitate towards what we might describe as kind of extreme right-wing policies, where the problem, I would say, for Christian citizens there is you're tempted to jeopardize biblical principles in pursuit of political power. But that there's also that same tendency on the left wing, the more progressive side. In fact, there might be even stronger evidence that that's happening. So I just wanted to get your perspective on serving in Romania, and then coming back here. The podcast, we want to be Christians first. We also recognize we're in a participatory democracy with a primarily two-party system. And so this is always going to be messy, but I'd just be interested in kind of your perspective on how Romanian Christians dealt with that, and then how Christians here in the United States are dealing with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a while since I've been there, but I recall lots of different conversations about who was running for what and political parties and whatnot, but it wasn't polarized among Christians because there was no even hint of a party that was devoted to certain Christian worldview principles, or even trying to be devoted to even some of them as a big plank in the party. And so because of that, Christians kind of fell all over the place as to where they thought they would align it. But because evangelical Christians in particular were such a minority, oftentimes they were just looking to the party that would actually just ensure that they could have church without being, without having restrictions placed on them, or, not being seen, because just not being ostracized as much in the society and whatnot. And so I think it's really different in other parts of the world where the alignment isn't. We've inherited a very strange alignment where you have, one of the things that I think is surprising to people is that neither political party in the United States can win without church-going Christians. The Democratic Party cannot win without their without the contingent of predominantly Black evangelical Christians who, at least from a theological perspective, most of them hold to evangelical essentials, and yet tend to vote overwhelmingly Democrat and are one of the biggest church-going segments of the population. And the Republican Party can't win without the enthusiasm of white evangelicals. So the fact that I'm even speaking of white and Black evangelicals as the distinction here shows the legacy and all sorts of things that we could write books about to talk about how we kind of got to this sort of to this place. But and then the different parties, and because of that, the way that political affiliations work is that they do shape, Christians shape politics, but politics also shape Christians. Wow. And so the way we prioritize things, the way we think of the political task, the significance that we put in a vote we're casting can all be very different based on this. And so I think it's encouraging for us, or important for us, to look to other parts of the world. I did an interview recently with a pastor in England who, shepherding his congregation through Brexit and through all of that, and a lot of the but looking at the way that other cultures do this, it's very different than it is here. And I think there are aspects of our our way I wouldn't want to trade, and there are some things we could learn from the Christian witness of others that I think would be helpful for us to just get a little more perspective on how, what our responsibility is as citizens.
Well, and you've mentioned a question that is perhaps the most unsettling question for me, and that is, how can Orthodox Christian believers be so politically divided in the United States? It's like you said, there's a lot of history there, a lot of cultural issues, and looking forward to having Justin Gibney on from the AND campaign to talk further about that. But that's really helpful. Just looking past our own context to see how other Christians have done it are doing it is very helpful. So I wanted to ask you, just any recent kind of meaningful moments in your ministry where you've sensed God moving and using you?
Yeah, I'm beginning an interim pastor role at a church here locally. So I'm going to be for the next few months or so preaching quite regularly, and just started that yesterday. And that's been awesome. That's been something I see myself as a writer first before anything else. But I have always, I just love the honor of studying God's word and then opening God's word up to deliver it to a congregation, and to see life transformation happen over time as people are exposed to the word. So that's one of the things that I'm excited about adding to a pretty full plate already, but it's just a temporary season. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the Lord does through that.
That's amazing. It's amazing. And I've stayed on as a teaching pastor at my local church. I preach once a month on Sunday morning, and it literally is one of the highlights of my work. Like you said, just breaking open the word, sharing it with people. It is a blessing. Before I jump into kind of our last question, I did want to also mention, we won't get too deep into it today, but another book that you wrote called The Multi-Directional Leader, especially leading through things like COVID and others, I found that very helpful. And so we'll link to that in the show notes as well. I've had so many pastors tell me, like, they didn't teach me Pandemic 101 in seminary and all those different things. So I appreciate you writing that book as well. So if you had a kind of a billboard on which you could put a message to the gospel preaching church in the US, what would you put on it?
I thought about this. This is one of the questions you sent ahead of time that I thought, there's all sorts of things that I was thinking of first. I was thinking of ways to, things to keep billboards that would keep Jesus central, keep the gospel as the main focus and whatnot. And I think that's where I would likely tend. But then I just kept going back to because it's a billboard, it's got to be short, it's got to be pithy. I just keep going back to look local. Look local. I keep thinking that's kind of the thing I'd love to just see in headlights, just in blazing lights for people to really look at, because I think the temptation for so many of us is to get so consumed with distant drama. Whatever's happening in other parts of the world, where we really, or whatever's happening in Washington, D.C. this week or today, that we really don't actually look around at the neighborhoods and the communities and the church and the schools where we actually could have an impact on something. And I mean, I don't say this because I've got this all figured out. I mean, I'm one who pays a lot more attention to national politics than local politics, but I could have a bigger effect locally than I do nationally. The same thing with, you can see tragedies and disaster strike in other parts of the world and miss the fact that there's someone in your own community or church that's actually hurting. Or you can be so consumed with the drama of what's going on in social media, even in your own denomination or in your the circles that you run in, that you miss the fact that there's actually other temptations and dangers and things happening in your own congregation. And so just this look local idea just kept coming back to me. And so I think that's what I would say is don't be so taken with what's happening out there that you miss what's happening right around you, where you actually have the most ability to actually affect change in a positive way.
That is such an encouragement, and you may not know that, but that is actually one of the points of this podcast, is to help Christians navigate it, but also say probably have your greatest impact in your own zip code. And
That's
so
right.
let's focus there. So I'm grateful for that reminder. Such a great word for Christians as we navigate these times. And back to really all that back to kind of all that we talked about with navigating expressive individualism, with getting out of your echo chamber. So much of it relies on having a cup of coffee with somebody or sitting down with them. And that doesn't happen if you're just all the way, constantly scrolling through a national news media concerned about what's happening out there. So
That's right.
yeah. Well, Trevin, how can listeners find your work? I know you have a blog there at the Gospel Coalition, but what are some places where they can follow you?
Yeah, they can just find me on Twitter, Trevin Wax, or on Facebook as well, Trevin Wax. My column at TGC is just, if you go to trevinwax.com, it'll take you right there to the column at Gospel Coalition. You can usually at the end of every article, I'll have a little link there where you can sign up to get future articles if you want to get those in your email. But yeah, I would love to connect with people, and glad to hear that people are benefiting from some of the things I've been able to write.
Yeah. Well, Trevin, thanks so much for taking some time to talk to us today. I appreciate your work and your continued work in trying to navigate these changing times.
Thank you for having me, Josh.